عن دينكم بالغات آذانكم للعظات من منهج دين قائم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. David McCullough, an American historian, said, "History is who we are and why we are the way we are." Inshallah, on this episode of In the Light of Ramadan series, we'll be taking a deep dive into history and talk about the lost city of Andalus. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ during his time sent companions on missions to spread Islam across the world. This practice continued after his death, and one of such practices and messages led Muslims to Egypt. When Muslims got to Egypt, they were ruled by the Byzantine Romans, and they weren't fully supported by the people of Egypt. By the support of people of Egypt and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Muslims were able to overthrow them and take rule. Over the years, the Muslims would spread out their tentacles across North Africa, and this went on quite alright. In year 711 AD, the governor of Muslims and governor of North Africa, Musa ibn Nusayr, received a call for support from the Unitarian Christians in Hispania. Hispania at this point was under a Visigotic rule led by Roderick, and there was conflict amongst them. Musa ibn Nusayr received this letter, and in response, he sent his general, Tariq bin Ziyad, to go on to support them. Tariq went with an army of 70,000 and met and fought an army of over 100,000 Visigotic ruler armies from Hispania. As Allah would have it, the Muslims came out victorious and they were able to take control of Hispania. The people of Hispania willingly accepted Islam, and before the coming of Muslims, the Jewish people were oppressed and weren't allowed to build synagogues and worshipped. This changed after the Treaty of Theodomir, which was inspired by the Muslims. This treaty basically gave them freedom of expression of their faith. So the Jews were able to build their synagogues and worship, the Christians were able to do the same, and the Muslims were able to do the same, and they lived peacefully. All this while, the generality of Muslims was being controlled by the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus. In year 750 AD, the Abbasid revolution occurred and they overthrew the Umayyad Caliphate and they took power. However, a young prince called Abdurrahman ibn Muawiyah escaped. Abdurrahman, dubbed as Sakul Quraysh or Falcon of the Quraysh, escaped with his slave and would wander about for a few years. After a while, he sent his slave to Hispania. When the Muslims took over, they called Hispania Andalus. So as we move on, 1 year Andalus, it's the previous Hispania land. So the slave went to Hispania, Al-Andalus, and asked if they would welcome Abdurrahman. They replied in the affirmative, and Abdurrahman came to Hispania, Al-Andalus. They appointed him the king, and he ruled with mercy. An exciting part of the story didn't start with Abdurrahman, but with Abdurrahman III. Abdurrahman III was a very, very passionate person about science, knowledge, and beauty. So first thing Abdurrahman III did was to change the capital of Al-Andalus from Seville to Cordoba in Arabic, or Cordoba in Spanish. Then he made Cordoba the most advanced city in the entirety of Europe. It was the largest city in the entirety of Europe also. Cordoba witnessed different scientific discoveries, as many scientists were there, and many scientists migrated to Cordoba in Al-Andalus just because of the reputation it had. A few things that were very special about Cordoba was that it was the first lighted city. As a matter of fact, in some places you see Cordoba being addressed as the city of light. There were about 10,000 lamps in the city that you could walk at night as if it were the day. There were about 200,000 houses, 300 libraries, 600 masajids. It even at that point had the largest worship center in the entirety of Europe. Abdurrahman III himself had a personal library of over 300,000 books. This goes on to show how passionate he was about knowledge, and this brought scientists. Some scientists like Al-Khwarizmi, who at that point stayed in Baghdad. He wrote a book called Al-Jabr, which would go on to understand to be algebra. He also wrote something on alchemia, which is alchemy, which goes into chemistry. This point in time was a time where Muslims were the one championing the cause of science, both in Andalus and Baghdad. Baghdad, we had Darul Hikmah, House of Wisdom. So in these two countries and cities, there were people who migrated there just to check how magnificent it was. Some of the scientists that were Muslims and originated some scientific fields are, we have Ibn Sina, father of medicine. We had Al-Zahrawi, father of modern surgery. We have Al-Riza. We even had in Cordoba Abu Khair, who wrote a book on farming. We have Abu Awam, who wrote a book describing 568 plants. Some scientific fields that were brought forward by Muslims include taxonomy, pharmacology, medical ethics, surgery, medicine, geography, geology, geometry, taxonomy, and many much more, to mention a few. The collapse. I've said a lot about Cordoba and Al-Andalus, but you would agree with me that all I've described don't seem to be true, because currently Spain isn't even something I've described it as. This is because this modern era of Islamic rule came to an end. Just as we know, every good thing or even bad things must come to an end at some point. The collapse of the Muslim rule in Andalus didn't happen in a year. As a matter of fact, it went through a long century. Mind you, this rule of Muslims in Al-Andalus spanned across 700 to 800 years. The collapse began when the Islamic leaders became greedy and started to want more power. They, as a matter of fact, went ahead to start paying a particular individual just for a form of protection. So you had to kind of pay yearly tribute to maybe the Khalifa so that you can protect your city or your area. And this started causing internal conflict, and the Berber army, they saw it as an opportunity and kept attacking. One of such attacks that went down in history is the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. The Muslims never quite recovered from this. And as Allah would have it, over the years, over the centuries, over the decades, the Muslims began to lose more lands. And then the Christian rules coming in started oppressing the Muslims. This period of oppression led to a term called Moriscos. The Moriscos were people who were internally believers in Allah, but due to oppression, they were outwardly Catholics. That is, they will probably do some Catholic thing outside and then go into their place and their private areas and pray to Allah and ask for His forgiveness. One of such oppressions happened in 1501 in the Great Fire of Granada, where all these books, I mean, there were about 600 libraries, and even Abdurrahman III himself had over 300,000 books. Everything was burnt. The discoveries, the inventions, everything was burnt. And that's why it would seem as if some of these things weren't true. Now, I believe I've been able to take you down memory lane, and then every one of us would be able to have one or two things to say about the lost city of Andalus and the collapse, and be able to share the good story of how Muslims were once leading and were in rule and were the major advancers of technology. Now, why have you brought to this in the month of Ramadan? This is because of two major phenomena, Medina to Zahrawi and Zahrawi himself. Abdurrahman III, after having everything, he felt it was time to move on. And the next step for him was to acclaim himself to be the Khalifa. Obviously, there were a few opposition to this, but as he was one of the most powerful, these oppositions didn't really materialize. So as a Khalifa, the first thing that was expected of him was to build a new city for himself. He didn't mind he had Cordoba under his belt, he wanted more. So he went ahead to build Medina to Zahrawi, which was named after his most favorite concubine called Zahrawi. Medina to Zahrawi, also named City of Brilliance, as some people would say. Medina to Zahrawi was even more grander than Cordoba. I mean, I've described Cordoba. Now I'm telling you there's something more grand than October. You can imagine how grand it will be. Let's take for example, the floors of Medina Zahrawi were made of brocade. Brocade is a material worn by the richest of people in the time. To bring this into more context, or bring it closer to us, imagine there's a city where the floors were made by Gucci wears. Imagine that. Now, this Medina Zahrawi was so grand that some say it took 25 years, others say it took 40 years to build. But on the day they built this city, they were celebrating and they were joyous. They were celebrating for the city that it has finally come, but they were even celebrating more things than that. They were even celebrating something more important, which was the birth of an entity, a phenomenon which would go on to take the name of the city down memory lane. His name, Abdul Qasim Khalaf ibn Abbas al-Zahrawi al-Ansari, was a descendant of the Ansari. Al-Zahrawi, as is popularly called, was or is currently called the father of modern surgery. Al-Zahrawi had a very curious mind and was also very passionate about knowledge. Most sources say he had even memorized the Quran at the age of 12. Al-Zahrawi went ahead to write a book called At-Tasrif, which was about 30 volumes, an encyclopedia of psychology of surgery. Al-Zahrawi, even till now, about 200 of his inventions are still being used. I mean, could you just picture, after years, he was born 1936 AD. Now this is 2022 and there's someone somewhere undergoing a surgery, and the tool they are using is either one invented by him or one that was built out of his idea. That's a very awesome Sadaqah Jariyah. The people of Medina Zahrawi, they were celebrating a city. Little did they know that there was even an entity that would last longer than the city. Many people said Al-Zahrawi, Medina Zahrawi didn't last more than 40 years. But Zahrawi till now, decades, centuries have passed, but we are still referring back to him. This is what I charge my fellow Muslims to be. Just like we always say, Muslims should chase less after material things and go more after knowledge and good deeds. In this month of Ramadan, we should try to prioritize good deeds and acts of goodness to humanity, so that we are not like Medina Zahrawi, but the city of knowledge himself, Al-Zahrawi. Al-Zahrawi died in the 8th day of Ramadan, and that's why we are bringing this to you during this month. So what are the benefits of this beautiful story? Like I've mentioned, Muslims should chase less after material things and go more after beneficial knowledge and even acts of volunteering that could impact humanity in positive ways. We should try to be agent of change and always command goodness wherever we are. Also, Allah in the Holy Quran, Surah Al-Imran, Quran 3 verse 110, Allah said He has produced Muslims to be the best of all nations. As an example, we enjoy evil, good and forbid evil. This is indeed powerful. Like I said at the beginning, history is who we are and how we are the way we are. Muslims from the Quran, Allah said we are the best of all nations. But how have we gotten to this point where we are? So it's up to you and I to consciously take effort to go in line with that description of Muslims in the Al-Quran. Also, I would like us and I would charge us to study more about history. With history, we begin to even understand who we are. Many people wouldn't have known about Al-Zahrawi that he was a Muslim. We have the likes of Ibn Sina, who is the father of medicine, he was a Muslim. We have Al-Razi. Some of the fields I had mentioned, taxonomy, chemistry, some of them were propagated by Muslims. I mean, we use Arabic numeral, the 1, 2, 3 we use. Where do you think that came from? So history would empower us more and further charge us in the right direction. I pray Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes the little I've said beneficial for us and accept all our acts of ibadat in this month of Ramadan from us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
شهر ذي كل نعمتي رحمة بعد رحمتي ليلة القدر والتراويح كونهما ترى فاعلات مفاعل فاعلات مفاعل